coming up. If I was going to paint David and Goliath, I would paint that moment because you've got a bloody dripping head.
Your tip of your finger should not extend any lower than your genital area.
Oh. Before you've had life breathed into you, Leslie, you're very rubbery. I've heard.
Right, so this is what I need for my Pilates class.
Yes, exactly.
Because I can't get into those positions.
Hello, my name is James Payne and I'm the author of Great Art Explained.
And hello, my name is Leslie Primo and I'm the author of The Foreign Invention of British Art.
So this is a podcast about class, about artists from working class backgrounds or connected with working class backgrounds. And today we are going to concentrate on the artist Michelangelo.
So yes, we're going to start by looking at this iconic artist and his life. Of course, Michelangelo is from a background where his parents were, well, they worked in as local town officials. And I say his parents, in fact, his ancestors really, rather than his parents. So Michelangelo basically spends most of his life trying to get out of a situation of not being an upper middle class person. By the time he is born, his family's fortunes are in the doldrums, shall we say. So he spends most of his life trying to raise the name of the family. It's all about the family. It's not for any reason, it's not for no reason that Michelangelo doesn't call himself Michelangelo da Caprese. Because, of course, Caprese is where Michelangelo was born in 1475. And the reason why I say that, because, of course, Leonardo called himself after the town he came from, Leonardo da Vinci. And, of course, this is the sort of thing that Raphael did as well, Raphael Urbino, etc., etc. But Michelangelo firmly got rid of all of that and said, no, I'm not going to be that because I want to raise the name of the Buonarroti family. So he was always, right from the outset, Michelangelo Buonarroti.
Okay, so he is, his father was a minor official, and I think we could contrast him with Turner in this case, because his father didn't want him to become an artist. So
No.
Turner's father did want him to become an artist, was very much for it.
Yes.
But his father saw it as a step down to become an artist.
Absolutely.
Because of the way artists were perceived in this period of history.
Yes.
So, and as, so artists were really manual workers. And the funny thing is that when we think about artists now, we say, oh, they were manual workers. When Michelangelo, Leonardo, when they were, or Raphael, when they were apprentices, it was a manual work. They were mixing pigments, they were carrying big blocks of marble around. It was a hard job.
It's hard graft.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
So his father was very much against him because he saw it as manual status, right?
It was a step down, but what Michelangelo was trying to do is to say that maybe he single-handedly could raise this profession to a level where it was no longer seen as something that was beneath a person like from his family to actually be involved in. Just by sheer force of character, force of determination on the part of Michelangelo, that effectively is what he does actually achieve.
He saw himself as, if not only intellectually, he saw himself as divine. He was called Il Divino, right?
Yeah, well, see, that's the thing about writing, isn't it? Really, is that if you're going to be to be famous, what you need is other people to say things about you. And that's one of the things that was somebody else said about Michelangelo. It's no use saying something about yourself, because then nobody really believes anything you say about yourself, really, do they? What they do instead is that you need somebody else to say something. Look, like you need somebody like Stephen Fry to say, an instant classic, you see? And then once that happens, that's it, isn't it, really? And in Michelangelo's case, it's Giorgio Vasari who says all the nice things about Michelangelo. And in fact, it is Giorgio Vasari that calls him the divine Michelangelo, Il Divino. And what's extraordinary about Michelangelo's life is that you might not believe this now in the modern day and age, but Michelangelo is the first artist to have 2 biographies published about him within his lifetime. Never been done before. Nowadays, we're all doing it all the time, aren't we? Talking about ourselves and having stuff published on ourselves in our lifetimes.
But with the second biography, well, because Vasari wrote up biographies for other people in his famous book.
He did.
Who were still alive, of course.
Indeed.
So,
well, were they?
Was Leonardo still alive?
No.
Was he not? Oh, okay.
No. In fact,
so were none of them alive?
No, they're all dead.
Okay, except for Michelangelo.
Except for Michelangelo.
Okay, well, I got that one wrong.
Yeah, because Giorgio Vasari publishes in 1550. That's his first biography. Michelangelo is still alive, clearly. But Leonardo had died in 1519.
And Raphael?
1520. In fact, on the...
Leslie is very good with dates.
Yeah.
And I'm terrible with dates.
Raphael died on his birthday, the 7th of April.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like Shakespeare died on his birthday.
Yeah, he died on his birthday, the 7th of April. So, of course, he's dead. Botticelli, 1510, he was dead.
Oh.
Yeah. So all these people...
So, in fact, Michelangelo was the only one.
The only living artist alive.
But there you go. I learned something every day.
When he published.
But wasn't Michelangelo unhappy with what Vasari wrote? Isn't that why the second one was commissioned?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, he was unhappy about certain aspects about what. And one of the aspects he was unhappy about is that Giorgio Vasari said that Michelangelo had studied in the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio. Okay. And Michelangelo absolutely flatly refuted that and said that never happened. You've never studied under the great. I don't know why. Domenico Ghirlandaio's workshop was legendary. Right. It was a great workshop, but he refused to accept that he was ever even there.
It's medieval fake news, basically.
Yeah. Well, look, Giorgio Vasari then said, I found the contract between Michelangelo's father and Domenico Ghirlandaio.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was true then.
It was, but then when he was asked to produce the contract, Giorgio Vasari said, "Well, I've lost it."
It's like 2026. You don't know who to believe, right?
Yeah.
It's like you just
conveniently lost the contract. So that was it, really. So of course he then Michelangelo commissions his own biographer, Ascano Condivi. Yeah. And Ascano Condivi publishes his life of Michelangelo, a standalone life of Michelangelo, in 1553, just 3 years after Giorgio Vasari's biography. And of course that corrected all the things. But look, effectively, again, this is a first. This is an artist that commissioned somebody to follow him around. Yeah. And write about his life in the view to publishing a book on his life in his lifetime.
As we know, biography is not a a science,
No.
So it's still an opinion.
It is, yeah.
But he was very, very, very well known in his lifetime.
Yes.
So can we talk about his personality?
What do we know about his personality? Well, what we know is that he was temperamental. He's
curmudgeon.
Flew into a rage. He had blazing rows with popes. And in fact stormed out of the Pope's office, etc., after a blazing row with him. Now, look, Michelangelo said about about the Sistine Chapel ceiling that he started work on this, by the way, on the 1508. He says that he went to the Pope. The Pope at the time is Julius II, who's a member of the Della Rovere family, and also a very contentious and cantankerous Pope. Yeah. Actually, he said that he went to Julius II, who, by the way, was described by some people Julius II as more like Julius Caesar than Pope Julius II.
He was the Pope who went to war.
Yeah, went to war, wore armor under his cassocks, all that sort of stuff. Michelangelo said that he went to the Pope and said, "Your original scheme for the ceiling was absolute rubbish. Don't really like it." And then the Pope said to him, "Oh, you're right, Michelangelo. You can paint whatever you want to do." Right. The idea that conversation even took place is completely ridiculous.
Yeah. But really. We do know Michelangelo didn't want to paint that ceiling, right? We know that he wasn't interested in painting because he wanted to sculpt.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, interestingly, a sidebar is that another sculpture of his, maybe not as well known, but Moses, his statue of Moses.
Yeah.
That was designed to be on Pope Julius
II's tomb.
Yeah. Including, was it 40 statues around
40
it
statues,
as well?
Yeah.
So, I mean, and that's actually one of my favourite Michelangelo sculptures. But interestingly enough, he was one of the most pompous popes in history.
Yes.
And then people nowadays don't know exactly where he's buried in the Vatican because he was supposed to have this big glamorous tomb designed by Michelangelo.
Well, Michelangelo describes that tomb as the tragedy of the tomb. That's how Michelangelo describes it in his own words, the tragedy of the tomb, because it took almost 30 years to complete that project. By the time he completed it, the Pope had been dead for about 20 years. Right. I don't know what they were doing with the body, but had been dead for quite some time.
He was pretty much the Pope who everyone hated, right? Is that fair enough?
Yeah, well, which popes didn't people hate?
Okay. Pope John Paul II, maybe? Yeah, that's true. That's debatable as well. It's all debatable, definitely, when it comes to the Catholic Church and the popes, definitely.
Yeah.
But anyway, he was a particularly hated Pope.
Yes, yeah. People, yeah, he wasn't liked, but the next person who came along after him was also hated as well. So,
But this comes back to the thing of great art coming from conflict.
Yes.
About how some of the greatest art movements in the world came out of the First World War, came out of the Second World War, came out of the Franco-Prussian War, the Impressionists. So and that great conflict between Michelangelo and Julius II.
Yeah.
Was is what produced great art, and these intercity wars in Italy were everyone was trying to better each other, trying to outdo each other. So conflict is a good thing in art.
It seems to work, doesn't it? Competition seems to work.
Competition
really?
works, because artists just
they thrive on the competition.
Yeah.
And I think with Michelangelo, though, that the problem that he had with Pope Julius II is that they were both too similar, really, and neither were wanting to back down, and both were completely, as it were, I suppose both were stubborn.
Yeah,
they were both really stubborn.
Julius's scheme for the ceiling originally was much smaller, much fewer figures, etc., etc. But do you think the Sistine Chapel would have been made without that Pope?
Yes, it would have, because we know that, in fact, there were schemes before that Pope by other popes previously. Right. And, in fact, lots of popes before that had their own previous schemes. And the idea was with the Sistine Chapel was when a new Pope came along, what they'd say, well, that's it. That was the last Pope. I want my scheme on this ceiling chapel. So, in fact, what we know is that previous schemes by Luca Signorelli were actually on the Sistine Chapel, and they were scraped off. Got rid of those because they were Michelangelo, because that was a previous Pope. I'm not having a previous Pope stuff, so I'm going to have my stuff. And indeed, it was thought, Michelangelo himself imagined that his work would not be there that long, that the next Pope would come along and scrape it off again.
Which was pretty standard in those days.
Exactly. Well. So little did he know that would stay.
Yeah.
In a way, Michelangelo's work that's up there still to this very day is an anomaly, because it's the work that remained.
Right.
All the other works that were there before have been completely stripped away.
I think it's definitely one of my favourite works of art in the world. Actually, it's pretty indescribable almost.
Well, I like it because it's bombastic. It's completely over the top. All the men and the women have huge amounts of muscles, and in fact, are almost indistinguishable, the men and the women. Really, they've all been working out really heavily, and everybody's totally nude in the middle of a church as well, which is absolutely amazing. And they're achieving extraordinary positions. I mean, have you ever looked at Adam on the Sistine Chapel?
Yes, it's very difficult.
Yeah, I'm trying to get into that position.
Yeah. The concept that people say, not everyone's, because I think really, really important to talk about when we're talking about artists. There's so many different interpretations of it, and let's not trust the artist all the time to have the right interpretation, because sometimes they are doing work which they don't really understand why they're doing it. So there's lots of different interpretations, but the interpretation of Adam is, of course, that he hasn't had life put into him yet, that the fingers haven't touched yet.
No, that's right.
So God is putting life into him. So he's floppy, and that, because in the next one, in the Garden of Eden, in the next panel up, he's very strong and powerful. So he's a bit weak and ineffectual.
So before then, he's able to get into positions that you couldn't possibly
he's rubbery.
Yeah.
Before you've had life breathed into you, Leslie, you're very rubbery.
Right. So this is what I need for my Pilates class.
Yes, really, exactly.
Because I can't get into those positions at all.
Have the life taken out of you.
Yeah, and then I can do all the bendy positions. Yeah.
But I do think that he was a revolutionary. I think it would be interesting in this particular podcast, maybe, if we talk about specific works of art with him. I think class is a little bit of a misnomer with him, but I think we wanted to put it in because he wanted to get outside of his class. And we can talk about class in a different way in this particular podcast. We can talk about the class of an artist, what that meant to be an artist, because before Michelangelo, an artist was a manual worker, considered the same as a carpenter. We've talked about this before. And after Michelangelo,
it changed.
Yeah.
It, in fact, had changed in his lifetime.
He changed the class of an artist.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he changed the game in terms of for artists, in terms of how artists were respected and the amount of respect that they could get given to them. Suddenly, they were maestros. They were, il divino. They were suddenly, and this only happens because of Michelangelo, really, because he pushes it much, much further. And without him, let's be clear, he's born in 1475, so that means he's born before Raphael, who was born in 1483. Leonardo, in 1475, Leonardo's still in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio and doesn't leave that workshop till 1476. So that means that he's there. Pushing the boundaries and the envelope in terms of creating the myth of
Yeah.
the artist genius.
Yeah, he created that myth. He really
Yeah.
did create a myth, but then he extended it. He kept going on and on and on because
Yeah.
he doesn't die till 1564. He's a very, very old man.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's working on the Rondinone Pieta, you know,
Yeah,
when he's dying.
Yes,
So
yeah.
he dies on the job.
Yeah, and
So-
just to say, the Rondinone Pieta, of course, is a small sort of a crucifix. It's right at the end of his life. You know, I mean, in a way, he goes full circle, doesn't he? Because he starts with the Pieta in 1498.
Yeah.
And then.
But he's still pushing, you know.
Yeah.
The important thing about him is he's still pushing, and I think he pushed those boundaries. I'm not sure whether class, as I say, is a topic connected with Michelangelo, but I do think the concept of the class of an artist and how that changed. You know, they went from lower classes to middle classes, basically.
Yes,
in a nutshell.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's absolutely changed it, and I think at that point, really, it's really worth mentioning something that I mentioned in my book here about the Renaissance, actually. And I'm going to just
Can we just explain the term Renaissance?
Well,
People who don't know.
Yeah, Renaissance means rebirth of the ancient world, rebirth of the classical world, because effectively Renaissance is just a reinvention of what's been done before. What they thought in that period, of course, roughly about 1420s through to about 1600, that sort of period, what they thought then was, of course, that everything that had been done in the ancient world was absolutely brilliant and far superior to what had been done now. In other words, the entire Renaissance is about nostalgia.
And 500 years later, we're still arguing about it, right?
Yeah, it's not arguing, but we're still doing the same thing, though, aren't we? We're still saying that things a long time ago were so much better, weren't they? You know, this nostalgia thing, and that's what they did. The whole Renaissance was things a long time ago were so much better.
And as you said to me earlier on, you know, Michelangelo wasn't walking around saying, "Hey, it's the Renaissance guys." You know, it's like they weren't calling it that at the time.
They were not.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Because this is a question that's just popped into my head and I don't know the answer to.
Oh, really?
So why did they use the French term instead of Rinascente? Why did they use Renaissance?
That's what I'm about to quote now for my book, strangely enough.
That wasn't planned. It wasn't planned. I didn't know this. Really?
That's what I'm going to quote now, yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
So, the Italian biographer Giorgio Vasari first mentioned the word Rinascita or Rinascimento, birth, in his Lives of the Artists in 1550. However, it is not until 1860 that the term Renaissance was first used by a Swiss art historian called Jakob Burckhardt, who used it exclusively to describe the visual arts in Italy in a period that he put roughly the 1420s to 1600. So in doing so, Burckhardt embedded this period into the artistic canon as a coherent cultural movement. So in other words, the word Renaissance doesn't actually appear till 1860, and the reason why Burckhardt uses that word is that, well, French sounds so much better, and it was fashionable at the time.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's completely fictitious, the idea that everyone in the Renaissance went around saying we're in the Renaissance, because they just simply didn't. The whole concept is invented in 1860.
Interesting. So I would like to reassure you that that wasn't planned. I have read Leslie's book, but it was about 6 months ago. So it's 4 months ago.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, it's so now we know what the Renaissance means. We're going to focus on this episode on certain masterpieces of his as well. And I'm going to read from my book now, if that's okay with you. So, because one of my chapters is on Michelangelo's La Pieta. La Pieta, it translates as suffering, pity the suffering. So what's really I find very interesting about this is that episode with Mary holding her dying son in her arms is not from the Bible. It was very, very, very unusual for them to sculpt or paint images that were not directly in the Bible.
Yes.
That does not appear in the Bible. So it's actually come from German art before that. So it's actually an episode that doesn't appear in the Bible. So that's interesting within itself.
Can I just say, before you get into this proper, that in fact there are certain stories that are not in the Bible that in fact are hugely popular still. For instance, the adoration of the Magi, or the adoration of kings. It appears in the Bible in two passages, Matthew 14 in the New Testament and Psalm 72 in the Old Testament. But what's not in the Bible is how many of them there were, where exactly they came from. The Old Testament says Tarshish, Sheba and Seba. We don't know where those places are. And what's also not mentioned in the Bible is the fact that there's a black king. None of that is mentioned at all. And in fact, the number of magi or kings is not mentioned in the Bible either. So all of the stuff that you see is also made up as well.
Well, it's quite often propaganda. You know, Mary Magdalene is not a prostitute in the Bible. It's never mentioned that she's a prostitute in the Bible, for example. She's become a loose woman because of history and politics, you know. So so those things, that there's so many things. I mean, if you think about the Gospels, for example, 4 Gospels, sometimes they don't have the same story, you know. Sometimes Nicodemus is there during the deposition. Sometimes he's not, you know. So he's popping in and out all the time. And so that's really interesting.
Isn't he supposed to have given up his grave?
Nicodemus, well, he's also the patron saint of sculptures, which is why I mentioned him.
All right,
And in fact, Michelangelo did a self-portrait as Nicodemus during one of his depositions, which is in Florence. In Italy. So one of his last, yet another unfinished work. I'm going to read about my chapter on La Pieta, which is, I'd say, my top 5 works of art in the world. I think it's the most moving piece of art I've ever seen in my life, and I cried several times seeing these images. So, the Renaissance saw a move away from images emphasizing Christ's divinity and immunity from pain, instead focusing on images of Christ's suffering and Mary's anguish, designed to encourage believers to think of themselves and their salvation in relation to Christ's suffering. As the earlier Pietas show, the complexity of the scene, a delicate woman holding the heavy dead body of her son, is difficult to balance or make into a coherent naturalistic composition. But through deception, the young Michelangelo would succeed where those before had failed. To demonstrate just how harmonious and poignant this scene could appear, he would have to create an anatomically impossible sculpture. Let's talk about Pieta, which is 1498. So he is very young when he does this, 24. It's the only work he ever signed, so he never signed any other works across Mary's.
You know there's a story about that, don't you?
Yes, I do. Why didn't you tell? Well, not everyone knows. I know it's a famous story, but not everyone knows. So why didn't you tell the story of why he signed it?
As usual,
if it's true.
If it's true, as usual with these stories, it's always somebody else talking about it, isn't it? Really, and in this case, again, it's Giorgio Vasari. Giorgio Vasari says the reason why he signed his name across the chest of the Virgin, which is, I must say, quite provocative, really, right down the middle of the cleavage, really. Anyway, he says the reason for this is that he, according to Giorgio Vasari, Michelangelo, went along to see where the statue and found a crowd of strangers from Lombardy singing its praises. Pretty good, really. Then he asked one of them who had made it, only to be told, our Gobbo of Milan made it. Whoever Gobbo is. We never find out who Gobbo is, by the way, just as well with a name like that. Anyway, Michelangelo stood there, not saying a word, but thinking it very odd to have all his efforts attributed to someone else. Then, one night, taking his chisels in his hands, he shut himself in with a light and carved his name on the statue. So the idea, of course, is that Michelangelo stood by while other people looked at the statue and said it was by Gobbo of Milan and said nothing. The idea that he would have done that really sounds...
The story is ridiculous, totally ridiculous.
Fantastical.
I mean, he did sign his work in other ways. For example, he used his self-portrait quite a lot. They say that the beard of Moses has a profile of Michelangelo in the soul patch.
See,
which is probably not true. I think it is true, funny enough.
I'm not going for that one, James.
I'm going for that one.
No.
I'm going for that one. Anyway, going back to what you just said about Mary and the indignity of signing across Mary's chest. What I reference in my book here is the fact that it's anatomically incorrect.
Right.
So, for example, if you take the early German Pietas, because the Pietas came from Germany, the whole idea of the Pieta, which is not in the Bible, German artists took it on themselves. And if you look at all of those early German Pietas, Mary is holding Jesus like this, and he's spread out like this, like a big solid rock, you know. Because Mary has to be delicate. Mary is the mother of Christ. She has to be delicate. And so how do you portray a woman holding a very heavy man on her lap? And if you look at La Pieta, it's perfect. You're looking in the distance, it's totally perfect. But if Mary stood up, she'd be 7 foot tall. So she's much, much taller than Christ. And then there's the other problem. The biggest problem is, how do you hold him on your lap? So Mary has her legs spread. Okay, that is very undignified for the mother of Christ. And Jesus is sinking into her lap. It's just perfection. How do you cover up that? Because when you first look at that, you don't realize her legs are spread so wide. And you do that by the material covering her legs. So,
Good job.
because he understands mathematics, he understands how your eyes work. You know, they're doing dissections, they understand how the body works, and they're starting to understand the triangular composition. They're starting to understand how our eyes work.
Yes.
You know, and that to me that's why that sculpture blows me away every
He
time.
understands his audience. Yeah, he understands how their audience works. But let's just think about why he does what he does. And why the Pieta looks like that. And let's be clear, Michelangelo does know about anatomy and the structure of anatomy.
And religion.
Yeah, and religion.
He understands religion. He's very religious.
Yeah, but it's that intimate understanding of anatomy that enables him to manipulate,
to play with it.
Anatomy.
You have to understand anatomy to be able to play with it so well. You know, not just him, but Leonardo as well. You know, they were and Raphael.
Yes.
They knew how to play with it, you know. And, you know, for example, you know, they're all dissected bodies, which, by the way, it's a myth that it was illegal. It's a myth that they did it in secret. They were quite open.
It's quite open. Yeah. What people don't realize, of course, is that this bending and reshaping of anatomical structures was something that was very much in place from previous artists as well. So if you look at all of Botticelli's works and look at all of his images of the Virgin Mary, they all have hugely elongated torsos, and of course, and very, very short legs. And of course, if you look at his Birth of Venus, Botticelli's Birth of Venus, you'll see that he's moved the elbow further up the arm than it should be. And so on. So it's been going on for quite some time. And let's be clear, Botticelli's born in 1445 and dies in 1510. So, of course, that means he precedes Michelangelo in terms of manipulation of the body. So by the time Michelangelo gets around to manipulating the body, especially the Virgin, it had been done already by Botticelli. By the time Michelangelo starts to do this sort of mannerist manipulation of the body, this is really when it starts to become noticeable by others. And the reason why it becomes noticeable by others and becomes this thing called Mannerism is that Michelangelo does it in such a public way. It's in the Sistine Chapel. It's in the Pieta. Everyone saw it. The crowds of Lombardy from Lombardy around the statue, as George Vasari was saying. So his work is really public, whereas Botticelli's work, still the same manipulation. Well, of course, we know that the Birth of Venus was painted for a private family. In other words, it was a Medici commission for a villa. So it's not
debated as well.
But it's not as though it was in a public place.
No, it definitely wasn't in a public place. Yeah. I mean, you know, that medieval sway that he has with, you know, the bend of the birth of Venus. I think it's slightly different in the fact that Michelangelo, he understands not just about manipulating the body, but manipulating the body so it looks perfect, so it looks like he's not manipulating the body. So when you look at La Pieta, you don't realize that once you see it, you can't unsee it. You know?
I had the same discussion over the Birth of Venus with some students of mine, and they couldn't see that was anything wrong with the Birth of Venus.
Right.
And that Birth of Venus, it's 1485 roughly. It's held up as the ideal of a woman, and in terms of a womanly form, it looks amazing. But what you don't see is the manipulation, because he does it so well. Until you realise, of course, that it's about proportions, isn't it? Really. And as I always say to people, the best way to measure proportions to know if they're correct is that your hand, if you're standing up straight, and you put your arm by your thigh, it should only reach about halfway down your thigh. Stand in straight position. Your tip of your finger should not extend any lower than your genital area. That's it.
That's interesting.
If your hand or your arm extends to your knee from a straight standing position, it's too long.
Then you're in trouble.
You're in trouble.
Okay, right.
That's what proportions work.
You could argue that he is painting a goddess. So he doesn't want to depict reality, because if you do look at some of his earlier paintings and later paintings, they're very different in terms of reality. You know, there's a lot of unreality in that painting.
There is, and that's the argument that's used quite a lot, that it's unreality, so she's a goddess, so you can paint her any way, she can have all these strange looking manipulations. But again, the other reality of it is it's more than likely that he's painting a woman called Simonetta Vespucci.
Right.
Who he was, we pretty much know he had an unrequited love for.
Yeah.
In fact, pretty much all the images of women in
Yeah.
Botticelli's paintings are probably Simonetta Vespucci. So there's a reality behind it, as it were. So yeah, this is the beginning of what we would now
Yeah.
call a Mannerist aesthetic. Yeah.
I think there's lots of differences here. I think if you look at Botticelli's Madonnas, for example, or, you know, they're much more holier than you're going to get from Michelangelo. I think this is when the age is transitioning, where they're starting to think of Mary as a mother.
Yes.
You know, I think for me personally, the reason I love La Pieta is being an atheist. It's a strange piece of work to love, but I think you can love it as a story of a mother and a dying son.
Yeah.
And I think that's intentional.
Yeah.
I think it's intentional.
Oh,
that
yeah, I think you're
he is
absolutely
now he is now concentrating on Mary as a mother and not just as a saint. You know?
I think you're absolutely right, and that is the difference, isn't it, between Botticelli's Virgin or Venus or whatever it happens to be, and the Virgin Marys. That Botticelli's ones are ethereal, aren't they? Really, they're untouchable. They're almost as though whereas Michelangelo's Pieta, his Virgin, that's a real woman.
It's a really interesting time in history because you know it's. As a regular person, I can't connect with Botticelli's Venus. I think it's one of the greatest paintings of all time, but I can't connect with it. But I feel like I can connect with La Pieta, you know, I think that is where the transition is happening. It's the same with David, for example, which we should talk about David as well while we're here.
I mean, it is an extraordinary work by any stretch of the imagination, really. And, you know, how it was done was extraordinary as well. We've got this block of marble that had been sitting there for a huge amount of time. Yeah. And frankly, the only reason why Michelangelo attempted this work in the first place is that he wanted to prove that he could actually do it. Yeah. And that all the other artists that had come before him would shied away from it.
So for those of you who don't know about the block of marble, it was misshapen. Someone had attempted to work on it before, and in fact they had put a hole all the way through it.
Yeah.
And so when you look at David to this day, the space between his legs is where the hole was, where the previous sculpture was. So it was very thin and very long as well. So it was how to get a sculpture of David into that small space.
Yes.
In my YouTube channel, I do an X-ray of it, so I show how you can actually fit it into that space.
Into that space, yeah.
Plug for my YouTube channel there.
Yeah. So for Michelangelo, it was a point of mastery over others. Yeah. Really, that's really it. You know, he wanted to prove that, and you know, Michelangelo abandoned a altarpiece painting in Rome for this commission. Right. Just left it unfinished. Yeah. It's still unfinished. It's in the National Gallery, the Entombment painting.
And that's going back to what we said earlier on. You know, art as competition is actually a really good thing. You know, he's like saying, Michelangelo saying, I'm better than Leonardo, I'm better than Raphael, I'm better than these people, you know. So it was to prove himself.
It was to prove himself, and it wasn't about money as well, because he got paid 60 gold ducats for the painting in Rome, for the church in Rome. Yeah. And because we got hold of Michelangelo's bank accounts in about 1972, we're able to see that, in fact, he paid back the Augustinian friars in Rome for the money that they paid him.
Oh, really?
He paid it back.
I didn't know that. Okay.
We see the money going back from his bank account, the Balducci brothers, back into the accounts of the Augustinian friars, because he basically left it unfinished. But he didn't care about the money because he wanted to do the statue of David.
Well, I think he wanted to speak, you know. I think he wanted to say something, and I think what he wanted to say is really, really special and really different. I think, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Michelangelo is all about the moment. The Renaissance is often about the moment rather than the whole story, you know. So, for example, La Pieta is the moment Jesus dies in his mother's arms. David is the moment he's thinking about, he's summing up what's going to happen with the giant, you know. So I think the most obvious thing to point out is that in the Bible, he's 12 years old. Yeah. And that is not a sculpture of a 12-year-old boy. No. You know, it's at best, it's an adolescent 19-year-old, 18-year-old. Yes. And that's because it's not David anymore. So it's Florence.
Yes, it's Florence.
It's about Florence. It's not about Florence, it's not about the Bible story.
No, it's about Florence being supposedly the underdog, as in the story of David, and being able to triumph over those who are larger and more well-equipped. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what it's about. Yeah. And look, you know, I've got the minutes here from the opera that commissioned the actual statue of David. Right. But it gives us an idea of how fast he was working. Right. Because he begins on the Monday, the 13th of September, 1501. And that's when they record the first hammer strike on the marble for the actual statue. By the 28th of February, 1502, they report back that it's half finished.
Right.
So 1501, September, February 1502, half finished. That gives you an idea of the speed that he's working on. Working on this, half finished at that stage. And then, of course, they do another report on the 25th of January, 1504, and that's where they say it's almost complete. 25th of January, 1504. So that's extraordinary speed for the size and of that work.
And he's still quite young at this point. He's like 25 or something?
Yeah, well, it's 1501 that he starts, and he's born in 1475, so yeah.
So it's young.
Yeah.
There are so many things about that. You could talk about that sculpture forever, actually. So I think, first of all, the fact that it represents Florence. If you look at the original position where it was in Pieta della Signoria in Florence, where the replica is now, is actually facing Rome. So the direction is Rome.
Absolutely.
That away. So, but if you think about almost every, the vast majority anyway, of artworks connected with the story of David and Goliath, the first thing you're going to think of is the triumphal moment. That's when you beat somebody, and that's when you beat the giant and you're holding up the head.
Yes.
Almost most artists portray it this way, holding up the head. And he portrays it very, very differently.
Hates it.
It's before, he's still got the what they called a puck.
Yes,
Puck?
because he's got a slingshot, isn't he?
He's still got a slingshot. He's still got the puck in his hand. He hasn't even loaded up yet.
Yeah.
So it's about thought, and it's about how they were thinking during the Renaissance, which is really a different way.
So he hasn't done a Gian Lorenzo Bernini on it then?
No, or Caravaggio later, or many artists, even Munch, these artists. Because if I was going to paint David and Goliath, I would paint that moment, because you've got a bloody dripping head.
But it doesn't get more of the moment, though, James, surely, than Gian Lorenzo Bernini's version of David, where...
I'm not saying artists don't always have a moment.
He gets him doing this, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He's right in the middle of the sling.
I think that's different. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think the Bernini one is different because it was designed to be in your space.
Yeah.
It was designed to be right with you. Where it is now is where it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
The David statue is different because where it is now is nowhere near where it's supposed to be, because it was supposed to be up high.
That's a tree, a different viewpoint,
Go on.
So let's tackle those bits that people think are a bit weird about it.
Okay, good.
What's he got really big hands?
He's got really big hands because it does make sense. Now, I used to tell my students when I took them around Italy, I used to say to them, when you go and see the statue of David, you have to go underneath it, roughly where his testicles are. So where his testicles are, you have to have them above your head like this and look up. And in fact, once you look up from that viewpoint, the hands and the perspective all come together.
Right.
So it's designed because Michelangelo knew exactly how you would see it. It was designed to be very, very high up by the dome of the Duomo in Florence. Yeah. And so the hands and everything comes into proportion. But the funniest thing I think about this sculpture is it was designed to be seen very, very far away.
Oh, because it's large, isn't it?
It was high.
Yeah.
It was high.
And by the way, viewers, if you want to see what this feels like, go to the Victoria and Albert Museum the next time you're in London, and there's a replica in the Victoria and Albert Museum. However, if you are flying all the way from the States, I wouldn't bother really. I'd just go straight to Rome if I were you. Go to the go to Florence, beg your pardon, and go to the Accademia itself. But
however,
there's a however.
The V&A has a fig leaf.
Yes.
So the V&A has a fig leaf which they use to cover up his genitals.
Yes.
But weirdly enough, most people don't realise that the Italians also covered up his genitals quite early on with the golden fig leaf. So the golden fig leaf. So it was covered up. But so all of those elements of design. But I think the most interesting thing about this is it was so high up, no one could see it. No one had binoculars. So you couldn't actually see it.
Yeah.
But he still makes the details so perfect because he did it for himself as well.
Although they did have optics.
Of course, a very, 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 very wealthy person could see it.
Yeah.
Maybe 20 people in Florence could see it, but thousands couldn't.
Yeah.
And so this artist is making this piece of work perfect to be seen from here, even though no one's ever going to see it from there. So, for example, the veins.
The veins. Amazing.
The veins are designed for a hand that's down here and a hand that's up here. It's a different blood pumping around the body. So it's all designed carefully. The eyes have the highlight in them, and you wouldn't have seen that. No one would see it.
Why is this fig leaf situation, why did they cover it up?
Because no one wants to see a penis in the 1800s, apparently.
Yeah, but at the time that it was actually put in front of the Signoria, it wasn't covered up then when it was taken there.
Well, even when it was unveiled, it was unveiled in the Piazza della Signoria. It never ever made it up to the top. Although they did do a replica of it centuries later. Even then, people complained about him being naked.
Right. So,
So there's lots of. I mean, for example, a very good thing about his nudity is if you look closely at his penis, and everyone wants to look closely at David's penis.
Not particularly.
Not everyone, no. But anyway, look next time you see David, look at his penis. What's wrong with it? There's something wrong with it.
I'm always looking at his bottom. I think.
Or his bottom, yeah. He's not circumcised.
Oh,
David is the king of the Jews.
Oh right. Oh right.
So he's not circumcised. So, for example, Michelangelo is harking back to the time when the ancient Greeks. If you look at an ancient Greek statue, they're not circumcised because they saw it as barbaric, and so Michelangelo is carrying on that tradition.
Okay, right.
Little things like, well, when we're talking about penis, Michelangelo, it's always little, but it's little things like that.
Yeah.
So it's why to me it's beyond a work of genius. Funny enough, I think when you see it in real life, it's stunning, but the proportions in real life just stand out a little bit too much.
Oh, right.
So I think if you stand lower, but everything about it, the way he uses burnish, for example, you've got the twig behind his leg, and that's simply because the marble was so
fragile.
Would have broken.
It
would have broken. It would have snapped.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
that's just a classic support situation, isn't it? Going on there. But look, this issue of censorship is one that will come back to haunt Michelangelo later on, wouldn't it? And of course, at the Sistine Chapel, that's where it come back to haunt him.
Yeah.
At the back wall of the Sistine Chapel, clearly he completes the Sistine Chapel ceiling between 1508 to 12. He signs the contract on the 27th of March, 1508, and then completes it. Not that he does it in that 4 years, actually. Although when you go to the Sistine Chapel, to the Vatican, they go, we did it in 4 years. Well, actually, for the first almost a year, it's been plastered by somebody called Pietro Rosselli, who does the first undercoat, as it were, before Michelangelo gets started. So in that fact, in a way, he completes it in under 4 years, really.
On his own.
On his own, yes. Well, I say on his own. He had quite a lot of assistants, actually.
Not painting.
Not painting.
Very, very few were painting.
Very few painting, but he had a lot of assistants, actually. In fact, we know that the master of ceremonies in the Sistine Chapel itself actually reported on the workmen on the scaffold, and he said, I quote, "They were raising great quantities of dust by their labours," etc. So there were other people there. But when it comes to the back wall between about 1535 and 41, that has an extraordinary amount of nudity, and of course that does get censored.
Well, they complained about it as well. That's why there's that legend of the critique of his of the nudity.
Yeah, that was Pietro Aretino.
Where Michelangelo paints a snake to bite his genitals.
Yes,
And then of course they were painted over afterwards.
They were painted over,
and when it was restored later on, in that incredible restoration. 30 years ago. I can't even remember
about that.
When they did it and the colours were. Wow, where did that come from? Is they couldn't take them off.
No, they couldn't.
Because, when you paint fresco, it seeps into the plaster.
It's a plaster, that's it.
And then when you overpaint fresco, it doesn't seep in, so it just paints on top. So now all those covered up bodies are really not how Michelangelo would have hated that, by the way.
Well, in fact, they did ask him to do it himself.
Yeah, and he refused.
He refused to come back and do it himself. In fact, he sent his assistant, Daniel de Volterra. And Daniel de Volterra, of course, who actually painted over all the rude bits, as it were, with little bits of black material on.
We should wrap up now.
Okay.
As we did, as Michelangelo's penises were. We're going to wrap up. And we are going to be talking about censorship more in other podcasts as well. I think both of us are fans of Michelangelo. I think when you've lived such a long life, it's hard to pick out masterpieces. So we concentrated on 3.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say they're my 3 favourites, but they're up there.
They're up there, aren't they, with Michelangelo? And the thing about Michelangelo, of course, is that I like him because he's just so bombastic. He's just completely over the top. He's the epitome of the, I suppose, the diva. Yeah.
I think, in one of his poems, he writes something really beautiful, which I really love, which is, he said, Io sono di essere brutto. So basically saying, I am ugly. And I think with him, because he thought he was ugly, he had a broken nose, which broke when he was a kid. He thought he was ugly. And from that, he creates this most incredible beauty, And I think, again, from conflict, came this incredible beauty.
That story is told again by another biographer, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
So, as we know. Of course, the other biographer is Benvenuto Cellini, of course, who's a well-known sculptor who wrote an autobiography. So it was not a biography per se of Michelangelo, it was an autobiography. He died before he could finish it. But in that autobiography, he talks about that moment where, of course, Pietro Torrigiano, the other sculptor, who was a former friend of Michelangelo, was fed up with Michelangelo boasting about his prowess, etc. And famously said that he gave him such a punch on the nose that I felt the bone and cartilage crush like a biscuit. So that fellow will wear my mark until the day he dies. And of course, that's exactly what happened, isn't it, really? And Michelangelo never really forgave him for that. And of course, felt hugely self-conscious about that broken nose for most of his life, really.
When you're someone who's so connected to beauty and don't feel beautiful yourself, it's a problem. Well, we are going to wrap up now, so let's say thank you very much for listening to us, watching us. And we will see you our next podcast. We're going to decide tonight what it is.